the town was alive in a way that few outsiders could notice at first. Not with noise or traffic, not with people rushing through the streets or lights flashing in a hurry. It was alive quietly, in the hum of electricity in the new streetlights, in the soft crunch of gravel under boots, in the smell of freshly laid asphalt that lingered long after the machines left. Evan Cross had walked these streets more times than he could count. He had bought his plot months ago, not because it was the trendiest development or the most luxurious, but because it felt right. There was order here, and Evan trusted order. Every boundary marker, every survey post, every freshly painted curb whispered that if you followed the rules, if you did the right things, you could claim something permanent. He liked that. For Evan, land was more than a home. It was a legacy. Something solid that carried forward through time. Something untouchable if handled properly. His father had always said, money comes and goes. Influence is fleeting. But land, clean land, with clear papers, that stays with you. Evan thought about those words every time he walked his property, boots scuffing dirt and gravel, eyes scanning the horizon for any signs that his boundary might be challenged. At first, the town obeyed the quiet rules of civility. Foundations went up slowly, one by one. Families moved in with cautious optimism. Builders measured twice, cut once, and left neat spaces between plots. It was polite. It was deliberate. It was everything Evan hoped a town could be. Then, the first sign of disruption appeared. Richard Hale. Richard's presence was impossible to ignore. He bought the largest plot in the development, the one nearest the main entrance, the one visible from the road. While others built modest homes that respected the scale of the town, Richard submitted plans for a mansion the size of half the other homes combined. It was bold, almost theatrical, tall ceilings, wide facades, heavy, imposing walls. And surrounding it all, a set of concrete barriers that seemed designed to intimidate rather than protect. Construction started immediately. Trucks rumbled in the early hours and left long after sunset. Cranes swung overhead, lifting materials with precision and power. And then came the walls. Not fences. Not decorative partitions. Walls. Thick, steel-reinforced concrete rising taller and broader than anything the town had ever seen. They blocked sunlight. They blocked sight. They blocked curiosity. People slowed down when passing by. Some admired the craftsmanship. Others felt uneasy but said nothing. Evan watched silently from the edge of his property. At first, he told himself it didn't matter. People have different tastes, different styles, different methods. Privacy is not a crime. And a wall does not necessarily mean conflict. But then, one evening, as the sun dipped behind the far hills, Evan noticed a shadow stretching across his land. The corner of the wall had crossed his property line. Not dramatically. Not carelessly. Not in a way that would attract casual attention. But to someone like Evan, someone who had spent hours studying his plot, someone who believed in boundaries, it was clear. The wall had extended past its rightful space. He measured again. Twice. 3 times. Photographs. Survey papers. Everything confirmed the same truth. It was deliberate. The next morning, Evan approached the construction site while workers adjusted the stone panels. The air was thick with dust, the sound of drills and hammers loud and insistent. "I think your wall is on my property," Evan said calmly, trying to speak above the din. The worker shrugged. "It's all approved," he said, almost dismissively. "Approved by who?" Evan asked. "The HOA," came the reply. Evan's chest tightened. The Homeowners Association, the very body supposed to ensure fairness and protect homeowners, was being used as a shield. Already. Even before the town was fully established. He didn't leave. He didn't walk away in anger. He documented. He photographed. He measured. He created a record of every inch the wall encroached upon his land, every day, every change. Days passed. The wall rose higher, thicker, more imposing. And then Richard Hale appeared himself. He stepped from a sleek black SUV, confident, polished, untouchable. He wore sunglasses even as the sun dipped, and his movements suggested he expected the world to step aside for him. Evan approached. "Mr. Hale?" Richard turned slowly, examining him as if sizing up an opponent. "That's me. I'm Evan Cross. I own the property adjacent to yours." Richard's eyes, behind dark lenses, didn't soften. He gave a nod that suggested acknowledgement without concern. "There's a problem with your wall," Evan said. "It crosses onto my land." Richard smiled, not friendly, not apologetic. "Our plans are approved. Everything is within regulation." Evan held his gaze. "I've checked surveys. I'm asking you to correct it before it becomes a legal matter." Richard shook his head, still calm, still confident. "You're wasting your time, Mr. Cross." And he walked away. That moment changed everything. Evan understood this was no longer just about property. It was about power. About influence. About rules being applied selectively. The next week, whispers moved through the town like wildfire. Neighbors asked questions. Some were curious. Some avoided eye contact. The wall had become more than a barrier, it was a symbol, a statement. And Evan made his choice. If the HOA would not protect his rights, he would fight himself. Calmly. Legally. Relentlessly. Because walls built on stolen ground might stand for a while. But in the end, they always crack. And when they do, everything built on them falls. Evan Cross spent the next few days watching. Richard Hale's wall grew taller, more imposing, and every passing hour made it feel less like a boundary and more like a statement. Trucks delivered concrete panels with military precision. Workers moved like clockwork. The sound of drills and hammers filled the air, echoing across the new streets, a constant reminder that the encroachment was deliberate. Evan had already prepared. Measurements, surveys, photographs, and notes were all in order. He knew he could present a case strong enough to challenge the wall legally, but he wanted to start calmly. Conversation first. Escalation later. It was late afternoon when Richard finally appeared in person. He drove a sleek black SUV onto his property and stepped out, sunglasses reflecting the low sun. Every movement screamed confidence. He wasn't a man used to being questioned, let alone confronted. Evan stepped forward. "Mr. Hale?" Richard turned slowly, taking a long look at him, assessing. "Yes?" His voice was calm, almost bored, as if he already knew the outcome. "I'm Evan Cross," he said. "I own the property next to yours. We need to talk about your wall." Richard smiled faintly, a controlled, knowing smile. "Yes, I've heard there's an issue. I hope it's not serious." "It is serious," Evan said. "The wall is built across my property line. I've checked the surveys. It's not a mistake." Richard adjusted his sunglasses. "Our plans were approved by the HOA. Everything is legal. Perhaps your survey is outdated?" Evan held the evidence he had collected. Photos, measurements, coordinates, all confirming the intrusion. "These are current. The wall is crossed onto my land. I'm asking you to correct it before this escalates." Richard's smile didn't falter. "Correct it? I think not. The wall is already built. Moving it would be costly, unnecessary, and frankly, unfair to me." Evan felt a tight knot form in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "It's unfair to take someone else's property without permission. This isn't just about cost. It's about law, fairness, and principle." Richard's tone dropped, a subtle edge entering. "Principle doesn't pay bills, Mr. Cross. Land belongs to those who protect it. I protected mine first." Evans stared at him. The arrogance, the confidence, the complete lack of respect for rules, it was all palpable. He realized that Richard wasn't just ignoring him, he was actively testing boundaries. And the HOA, by approving these plans, had given Richard a shield. The first seeds of frustration grew in Evan. He wanted to remain calm, to rely on facts, but Richard's dismissive attitude forced a decision. "You can try to dismiss this, Mr. Hale, but I'm not going away. I've documented everything. The evidence is clear. The law is clear. And if necessary, I'll take this all the way." Richard's smile faded slightly, replaced by a faint frown. But he quickly masked it. "You can try all you want, Mr. Cross, but you're stepping into waters that have already been charted. The HOA approved this. The wall stays." Evan's eyes narrowed. "That is your interpretation. Legally, it's encroachment." Richard gave a short, dismissive laugh and turned to leave. "Good luck with that," he said over his shoulder. The encounter left Evan shaken but resolute. He realized that Richard's confidence wasn't just personal. It was institutional. The HOA's support made Richard untouchable for now. That evening, Evan called a lawyer recommended by a friend. He laid out the facts, explained the situation, and went over every piece of evidence he had collected. The lawyer's reaction was measured but reassuring. "You have a strong case," she said. "Encroachment is a serious matter, and the documentation you have is excellent. The HOA's approval doesn't override property law." Feeling slightly more hopeful, Evan drafted a formal complaint to the HOA. Every email was polite, professional, and fact-based. He attached his surveys, measurements, and photographs. He asked for a review and correction. Days passed. And then came the HOA's response, a single, short email. "The structure complies with approved development plans. No changes will be made." Evan's stomach sank. The organization meant to protect homeowners had chosen power over fairness. Influence over truth. Authority over justice. He called his lawyer immediately. "They're siding with him," Evan said. "Even though the wall is on my land." "That's not uncommon," she explained. HOAs often prioritize approved plans, even if those plans are flawed. But that doesn't mean you're without options. Legal action is your next step. The next morning, Evan walked to the edge of his property and stared at the wall again. The concrete looked permanent, imposing, untouchable. But Evan remembered his father's words, "Land is proof that you stood your ground." The first confrontation had happened. Words had been exchanged. Principles had been tested. And now, the quiet fight was about to begin. Evan knew it wouldn't be easy. Legal battles take time, money, and patience. The town would notice, gossip, and take sides. Some neighbors might fear conflict and avoid him. Others might sympathize but remain silent. But Evan was prepared. He wasn't going to fight with anger or threats. He would fight with evidence, law, and persistence. Because he understood one immutable truth. Walls built on stolen land may stand tall for a while. But they cannot withstand patience, preparation, and justice combined. And as the sun set behind the growing concrete barrier, Evan made a silent promise: this wall would not remain. Not if he could help it. The first confrontation had ended, but the battle had only begun. The town, still young and fragile, would soon be caught in a storm of authority, pride, and law. The HOA, the neighbors, and Richard Hale himself had no idea just how far Evan Cross was willing to go. And that was the first day the quiet fight began. Evan Cross didn't sleep well that night. The outline of Richard Hale's wall lingered in his mind like a shadow stretching across more than just property. It stretched over his principles, over fairness, over the town itself. He had tried conversation. He had tried reason. Now, it was time to escalate. By morning, Evan had already made a series of calls. His lawyer had confirmed that he had a solid case, and she advised him to prepare meticulously. Surveys, photographs, timelines, notes from neighbors, all of it would be essential. Evan felt a mix of anxiety and determination. He was about to take on a man who had money, influence, and an HOA firmly on his side. The first step was clear: an independent survey. Evan hired a top-notch surveying firm. 2 men arrived early the next day, setting up tripods, measuring angles, and marking property lines with precision instruments. Evan walked with them, quietly observing every calculation. Each measurement reaffirmed the truth. Richard Hale's wall extended at least 3 feet onto Evan's property in several sections. "It's blatant," the lead surveyor said quietly. "Completely outside the approved boundary." Evan nodded. "That's what I've been telling them. I just need it documented now. Properly." The surveyors worked for hours, collecting precise data, photographs, and notes. By the end of the day, Evan had a thick packet of documentation, indisputable proof of encroachment. Then came the formal legal step, filing a complaint with the HOA and giving notice of potential court action. Evan's lawyer drafted a detailed letter, laying out the evidence, quoting property law, and requesting that the wall be corrected immediately. Days passed. Then weeks. The response from the HOA was a single, dismissive email. "After review, the structure complies with approved development plans. No changes will be made." Evan read the email 3 times. Each word burned. They weren't even denying the encroachment, they were ignoring it, hiding behind paperwork and approval stamps. "That's typical HOA behavior," his lawyer said calmly. "They don't like admitting mistakes. But this doesn't mean you lose. This means we escalate." Evan felt the tension rise again. But now, he also felt clarity. Escalation didn't mean conflict for conflict's sake. It meant strategy, law, and evidence. And he had both. The town started noticing the friction. Neighbors slowed their cars when passing Richard Hale's property. Some whispered about the ongoing tension. Others came to Evan, cautiously, offering small reassurances. "We support you," one neighbor said quietly, "but be careful. These things get messy." Evan nodded. "I'm not afraid of messy. I'm afraid of unfair." The first court filing was submitted, marking the start of what the local papers would later call the wall dispute. The HOA received notice, Richard Hale received notice, and Evan prepared for the inevitable confrontation in a courtroom. The first day of the pretrial hearing arrived. Evan dressed in a crisp suit, his survey documents in a neat folder, his evidence stacked meticulously. He had rehearsed what he would say. He had reviewed each photograph, each map, each note. Every detail had to be precise. Richard Hale arrived too, flanked by a team of lawyers and his personal assistant. He walked confidently, sunglasses shielding his eyes, a smile of quiet arrogance on his face. Evan felt a familiar knot in his chest but forced himself to breathe calmly. This wasn't about intimidation. This was about facts. The judge, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a quiet presence, called the case. The courtroom was small, but tension made it feel massive. Both sides presented initial statements. Richard's lawyers spoke first, emphasizing HOA approvals, development plans, and procedural compliance. They made it sound as if any claim by Evan Cross was frivolous. Evan's lawyer then stood, presenting the evidence, photographs of the encroachment, surveyor reports, timestamps, detailed notes. The clarity of documentation left little room for argument. Richard shifted slightly in his seat. Even his calm demeanor flickered under the weight of clear evidence. "You're claiming the wall crosses into your client's property?" the judge asked Evan, looking directly at him. "Yes, Your Honor," Evan replied, voice steady. "We have verified this through independent surveyors. The encroachment is deliberate, and HOA approval does not override property law." The judge nodded, reviewing the documents. "And what is your requested remedy?" Evan's lawyer spoke. "We request the removal of the encroaching sections of the wall, restoration of the property boundaries, and confirmation of adherence to legal property limits in the future." Richard's legal team objected, arguing that removal would be costly, that the HOA approvals legitimized the construction, and that no precedent existed for altering approved structures retroactively. The judge listened, but every argument met with Evan's documented proof. By the end of the hearing, the judge did not make a final decision but scheduled a formal trial, requiring detailed testimony, HOA board statements, and evidence verification. After leaving the courthouse, Evan felt exhausted but resolute. The confrontation had made one thing clear: Richard Hale would not voluntarily correct the wall, and the HOA would not protect him. Every step forward would require preparation, patience, and persistence. Over the next weeks, Evan poured himself into the case. He reviewed every survey, every HOA regulation, every property law that applied. He spoke to neighbors, gaining small testimonials about the boundary lines, the previous construction, and the development standards. He built a network of support. Meanwhile, Richard Hale seemed to sense the pressure. The wall was complete, but he began visiting the site more frequently, overseeing construction with increasing intensity. There was a hint of unease behind his confident exterior, the first sign that Evan's challenge was no longer something he could ignore. The stage was set. Legal documents were filed. Evidence was organized. Witnesses were ready. The town waited quietly, aware that the conflict between Evan Cross and Richard Hale would soon define more than just two properties. It would define fairness, authority, and trust in a town still learning its own rules. And as Evan crossed his property line one evening, surveying the wall from a distance, he whispered to himself, "This ends fairly. One way or another." The legal battle had begun, but Evan knew the outcome depended on persistence, clarity, and unwavering commitment to the truth. The first face-to-face confrontation had been verbal. The second would be in the courtroom. The stakes were higher now, and everyone involved, the HOA, the neighbors, and Richard Hale himself, would soon see that Evan Cross did not back down. This was more than land, this was about principle, and principles, once tested, cannot be compromised. The town, still young and fragile, had begun to feel the ripple effects of the wall. At first, it was quiet, subtle glances between neighbors, conversations held in whispers behind closed doors. But as the legal notices circulated, the tension became impossible to ignore. Evan Cross walked down the main street one evening and felt the weight of it. Families that had once exchanged polite greetings now avoided him. Cars slowed near Richard Hale's property, drivers staring at the towering walls, wondering what was brewing. The town's calm surface had cracked, and every eye sensed the storm underneath. Inside the HOA office, the board convened in a small, beige conference room. The walls were plain, the fluorescent lights buzzing softly, but the atmosphere was electric. Board members shuffled papers nervously. They had been used to being the ultimate authority in town, approving plans, managing disputes, maintaining a fragile balance. Now, one resident, armed with surveys, evidence, and determination, was challenging that authority. "Evan Cross is serious," said one member, rubbing his temples. "He's got a lawyer. He's got proof. And he's pushing for a correction." Another shook her head. But the plans were approved. "Richard Hale is a paying member. We can't just ignore him. He'll push back, and he has money, influence." The board chair, a thin, formal woman with sharp eyes, spoke. "We need to be careful. If this goes to court, the HOA's credibility is on the line. If we side incorrectly, it could cost the entire association in reputation and financially." Meanwhile, Richard Hale was already sensing that the calm he expected wasn't coming. His lawyers, usually confident, were now cautious. Meetings were longer, discussions more tense. The wall had been built, but the threat of legal action loomed over it like a shadow. Richard, who had always thrived on control, was beginning to understand something dangerous. Evan Cross would not give up. Back on his property, Evan continued documenting everything meticulously. Every inch of the wall, every change, every interaction with the HOA, every neighbor who whispered about what they had seen, it all went into his growing file. He knew that persistence, patience, and precision were more powerful than anger. One afternoon, a neighbor approached Evan as he reviewed survey maps under the shade of a tree. "Evan, you really think you can take on Richard Hale?" she asked quietly. He looked up, calm but resolute. I'm not taking on anyone personally. I'm standing for the law, for fairness. If I don't, who will? The neighbor hesitated. People are scared, the HOA, the other families, they don't want conflict. I understand that, Evan said. But fairness isn't optional. If everyone stayed silent every time someone took what wasn't theirs, the town would be built on fear and dishonesty, not rules. The conversation ended, but the words lingered. Evan knew the HOA had the power to slow him down, delay decisions, and frustrate him. But they could not erase truth. And truth, properly documented and presented, had a way of prevailing. Over the next few weeks, the tension escalated. Richard Hale began showing up at the construction site every day, inspecting the wall, ordering adjustments to landscaping, and checking that no new evidence could be gathered. Every visit was a subtle intimidation tactic. Evan noticed but refused to react publicly. He stayed on his property, quietly surveying and documenting, leaving no room for argument. The HOA, meanwhile, continued to offer vague responses, claiming review in process while secretly leaning toward Richard's side. Board members whispered among themselves, concerned about money, influence, and precedent. They underestimated one thing: Evan's persistence was not motivated by money or influence. It was driven by principle. Finally, the day came for the first formal mediation session, arranged by the court to see if a resolution could be achieved before trial. The room was tense, the kind of silent pressure that makes every step feel like a test. Richard arrived first, confident, as always. His lawyers flanked him, papers neatly stacked, prepared for any argument. The HOA board members arrived next, each sitting stiffly, glancing at Evan with a mixture of irritation and unease. And then Evan entered, calm, organized, carrying the weight of his evidence with quiet dignity. The mediator called the session to order. This session is designed to see if we can reach a resolution without going to court, he said. Mr. Cross, please present your case. Evan spoke clearly, calmly, and with precision. He laid out the evidence, the surveys, photographs, measurements, and timelines. Every claim was backed with data. The wall crosses my property line, Evan said. This is not an interpretation. It is a fact verified by independent professionals. I am asking that it be corrected, and that the HOA ensure this does not happen again. Richard Hale smiled faintly, as if the confrontation were a minor inconvenience. The plans were approved, he said. I've invested significantly in this property. Altering the wall would be costly and unnecessary. The mediator looked at him. Mr. Hale, approval of plans does not override property rights. The evidence here is clear. Even the HOA members shifted in their seats uncomfortably. They had never faced a resident who came fully prepared, armed not with emotion, but with documentation. Hours passed. Arguments were presented. Evidence reviewed. Witnesses, including neighbors who had observed construction and boundary lines, spoke in favor of Evan's claims. By the end of the day, it was clear that Richard could not ignore the facts any longer. Walking out of the session, Evan felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. No wall had yet been removed, no legal decision finalized. But he knew something important: he had made the town, the HOA, and even Richard Hale understand that he would not relent. He was not just a resident with a complaint. He was a force built on truth, principle, and persistence. That night, standing at the edge of his property, Evan watched the wall silently, imagining the day it would come down, replaced by fairness and legality. The battle was far from over, but the momentum was shifting. For the first time, Richard Hale felt a flicker of uncertainty. He had expected compliance, silence, fear. Instead, he faced meticulous preparation, unwavering principle, and a community slowly taking notice. The town, quiet for so long, was now alive with tension. Neighbors whispered, lawyers prepared, and the HOA realized they could no longer ignore the problem. And through it all, Evan Cross remained calm, steady, and patient. The first stage of confrontation had passed. The battle had moved from verbal disputes and HOA dismissals to the realm of law and principle. Walls could be built. Walls could be defended. But truth, Evan knew, always had a way of breaking through concrete. And the first cracks were starting to show. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and nervous energy. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, casting geometric patterns across the benches. Evan Cross sat quietly, files stacked neatly on the table in front of him, each document representing weeks of effort, patience, and unwavering determination. He had prepared for this day meticulously, and yet, a part of him remained calm. He knew this was not a fight of force or volume. It was a fight of facts, evidence, and principle. The case had drawn attention beyond the courthouse walls. Local newspapers had picked up the story, printing cautious headlines: wall dispute splits community and HOA controversy, landowner challenges neighbor's construction. Social media conversations buzzed quietly. People debated, speculated, and some even took sides. The town's fragile calm was gone. Everyone was watching. Richard Hale arrived next, flanked by his lawyers. He moved with the same confidence he had always carried, sunglasses shielding his eyes as if hiding from the scrutiny he was about to face. But there was tension in his step, subtle but unmistakable. His legal team whispered in quick, urgent tones as they arranged their papers. Evan's lawyer leaned over and whispered, "This is the moment we've been preparing for. Stay calm. Let the evidence speak." The judge called the session to order. His voice carried authority, calm and steady. "We are here to determine the validity of Mr. Cross's claims regarding property encroachment by Mr. Hale's construction. Let us proceed with evidence and testimony." Evan's lawyer began with opening statements. She spoke clearly, calmly, and directly to the court. "Your Honor, we are here because property rights were violated. Mr. Cross's land has been encroached upon by the wall constructed by Mr. Hale. This is not speculation. It is documented fact. Independent surveys, photographs, timelines, and witness statements confirm the intrusion. We ask for restoration of Mr. Cross's property and enforcement of fair boundaries." Richard's legal team countered immediately. "Your Honor, the construction was approved by the HOA, which oversees compliance in the community. The plans were reviewed, submitted, and accepted. Mr. Hale followed all procedural requirements. We argue that no encroachment exists that would justify altering the wall." Evan felt a familiar tension in the room, but he remained composed. He had prepared for this. Step by step, his lawyer presented the independent survey reports, showing the wall extending 3 feet onto Evan's land at multiple points. Photographs were displayed, with clear lines marking the original property boundaries. Maps were presented, showing exact measurements and coordinates. Even neighbors were brought in to testify about what they had seen during construction. As the testimony unfolded, Richard Hale's confidence began to falter. His lawyers whispered frantically, consulting papers, reviewing the survey documents, trying to find any flaw. But the evidence was meticulous, precise, and undeniable. At one point, Richard himself was called to testify. He rose, cleared his throat, and faced the judge. "I believe the construction was entirely within approved limits," he said. But his voice wavered slightly, betraying the first sign of doubt. He was used to control, to influence, to bending situations in his favor. This courtroom, and Evan's preparation, were uncharted territory. Evan watched quietly, his gaze steady. He felt no triumph, only focus. Every inch of the wall, every document, every witness statement was part of a larger truth that could not be ignored. Hours passed. Witnesses were cross-examined. Experts explained survey methodology. Lawyers debated the weight of HOA approvals versus property law. Each argument further cemented Evan's position. Slowly, the courtroom began to sense a shift. The local media were present, taking notes and whispering quietly. Cameras did not capture dramatic shouting matches or sensational fights, they captured meticulous, deliberate advocacy for what was right. The story of principle versus influence, law versus convenience, was unfolding in real time. By mid-afternoon, it became clear to everyone present that Richard Hale's position was weakening. The walls he had built so confidently were beginning to feel less permanent, not physically, but symbolically. Evan's calm, methodical approach, supported by irrefutable evidence, was forcing even the HOA to reconsider its earlier dismissal. The judge paused, reviewing the maps, photographs, and survey reports. "It is clear that there is a measurable encroachment onto Mr. Cross's property," he said. "HOA approval does not supersede property law. The evidence supports correction." A hush fell over the room. Even Richard's lawyers were silent, realizing that their strategy of relying on procedural approvals was collapsing under the weight of actual property law and fact. Evan's lawyer then outlined the requested remedy: removal of the sections of the wall that encroached upon Evan's land, restoration of property boundaries, and a formal confirmation from the HOA that future development would respect verified property lines. The judge nodded. "This seems reasonable. I will schedule a date for an order to enforce these corrections. Further instructions will follow regarding compliance timelines and oversight." Richard Hale's face remained calm, but Evan noticed subtle tension in his jaw. His usual aura of control was slipping. He had expected resistance, yes, but not the certainty of legal principle against him. After the hearing, Evan stepped outside into the late afternoon sun. The streets of the town were quiet, but he could feel the attention. Neighbors glanced at him as he walked back to his property, some nodding with quiet approval, some whispering among themselves. For the first time, he sensed a subtle shift in the community, a recognition that fairness, not influence, could prevail. Later, standing at the edge of his property, Evan looked at the wall again. Concrete, steel, imposing as ever, yet somehow diminished. It no longer symbolized invincibility. It symbolized a challenge that could, and would, be corrected. Evan realized that the battle was far from over. Court orders would have to be enforced. The HOA would need oversight. Richard Hale would resist in small, procedural ways. But Evan felt a sense of control that had been absent before. The first stage of courtroom validation had been achieved. The truth had begun to assert itself against influence. And for the first time, Evan allowed himself a small thought of hope. The wall could be corrected. The property restored. And the town, still fragile, could witness that justice, patience, and unwavering principle matter more than money or power. The stage was set for the final showdown. The courtroom drama had captured the town's attention. Richard Hale's overconfidence was cracking. The HOA could no longer ignore its responsibility. And Evan Cross, calm, prepared, and principled, had proven that one person, armed with truth and persistence, could confront the strongest walls, both literal and figurative, and win. The battle was not yet fully over. The next steps would bring enforcement, public attention, and the final resolution. But one truth had been firmly established: Evan Cross would not back down, and no wall, no matter how high, could withstand preparation, persistence, and principle. The morning sun hit the town like a spotlight. For weeks, tension had thickened the air. Now, it was time for action. The court's order had arrived. The encroaching sections of Richard Hale's wall were to be removed and the property boundaries restored under oversight. The HOA, finally forced into compliance, sent representatives and a small construction team to supervise. Evan Cross arrived early, surveying the scene. Concrete barriers that had once seemed permanent now looked fragile, like obstacles waiting to be corrected. Richard Hale, on the other hand, arrived with a sharp suit and a forced calm, flanked by a single legal advisor. His confident stride was more defensive than assertive, a stark contrast to the towering wall behind him. "This is the reality," Evan's lawyer said quietly. "The court is clear. No further argument. Compliance is mandatory." Richard Hale's eyes flicked over the wall. For months, he had maintained control over it, over the project, over the narrative in the town. Now, standing before the evidence of law and principle, his authority felt hollow. The demolition team began work. Concrete panels were carefully dismantled, cranes lifting pieces methodically. Dust rose into the morning sky as walls that once symbolized Richard's power now became the physical proof of accountability. Each section removed revealed more of Evan's rightful land, open and ready for restoration. Neighbors started to gather, curious and quiet. The story they had watched unfold for months was now visible in real time. Some whispered encouragement to Evan. Others simply observed, the tension from weeks ago finally easing. Even the HOA representatives, who had spent so long defending approvals, now took meticulous notes and ensured compliance. Richard Hale stood beside the wall, arms crossed, eyes narrow. He watched as control slipped from him, the physical reminder of his arrogance coming down piece by piece. No threats, no influence, no dismissive smile could alter what was happening. The law had spoken, and action was being enforced. Evan stayed on the sidelines, calm, observing. His hands were folded behind his back, his eyes tracing the restored boundary markers. Each crane lift, each dismantled panel, felt like a step toward justice, not just for him, but for the integrity of the town. By midday, the wall sections encroaching on Evan's property were removed entirely. Surveyors returned to confirm measurements, ensuring everything aligned with legal boundaries. The HOA, once hesitant and dismissive, now signed off on the corrections, their paperwork reflecting compliance rather than preference. Richard Hale, finally, walked away from the site, silent. The arrogance that had defined him through construction, meetings, and confrontation was replaced with quiet acknowledgement of reality. He had lost this battle. Evan's gaze rested on the cleared land, open and free. The wall that had symbolized control and unfair advantage was gone, replaced by space, truth, and fairness. The town, quietly observing, began to breathe again. Balance was restored. For Evan, this was more than land. It was a confirmation that principle, preparation, and persistence matter more than influence or intimidation. The legal process had not been easy, but it had worked. And the town, once tense and divided, had witnessed accountability in action. The town was quieter than usual that morning, but in a calm way, not tense. The wall that had divided neighbors, challenged authority, and stirred months of conflict was gone. In its place lay Evan Cross's land, open, measured, and restored exactly as it had always belonged. Evan stood at the edge of the property, hands resting lightly on the wooden survey stakes that marked the true boundaries. For weeks, he had walked this land imagining what the town might look like if justice failed. Now, with the wall removed and surveys confirmed, that fear evaporated. Richard Hale arrived last, reluctantly, walking slowly toward Evan. His face was unreadable, but Evan could sense the first cracks in the arrogance that had defined him for months. There were no cameras here, no lawyers, no words prepared for battle, just two men standing on land that had been the center of a months-long showdown. "You've been persistent," Richard said finally, his voice low, almost grudging. "I didn't think you would carry this through." Evan nodded. Persistence isn't about winning against someone personally. It's about standing for what's right, for boundaries, and for fairness. The law doesn't belong to one person, it belongs to everyone equally. Richard's shoulders relaxed slightly. "I underestimated you, and maybe the HOA as well. They backed me too quickly." Evan's expression remained calm, but firm. Influence can protect for a while. But facts, law, and principle endure. That's what matters here. The HOA board members, present now to witness the final compliance, nodded quietly. They had learned a lesson the hard way. Future development approvals would require independent surveys, clearer boundaries, and accountability mechanisms. The organization had survived, but its authority had been tested and corrected. Neighbors, who had observed the walls dismantling over weeks, started approaching cautiously. Some offered congratulations, others shared relief. "We've been waiting for this to be resolved," one neighbor said, smiling. "It feels right now." Evan smiled back. He had not sought attention, but he understood the power of example. This wasn't just about him and Richard Hale. It was about the town, the HOA, and every future homeowner who might rely on fairness, law, and community trust. Richard Hale, surprisingly, extended a hand. You did it the right way. I'll respect that. And I'll make sure future construction stays within boundaries. Evan shook it firmly. No triumph, no gloating. Just acknowledgement. That's all anyone can ask for.